Okay, national government. We're continuing here on equal rights. We're in slide number 7 of the PowerPoint, talking about soft despotism. Okay, this is a section of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, one of the more famous sections of the whole book. And what he's talking about here is the tendency within democracies, of which America was the prime example, to emphasize equality so much that so many people would begin to start looking to the government, perhaps, to make them equal or to give them their equal rights. And what would ultimately happen is it would lead to a citizenry that would cease to think like adults and would revert to some form of childhood, okay? Because they're again, think of a child continually relying on a parent, right? As far as for food and for clothing or for whatever. And again, he wrote this in about 1835, okay, mid-1830s. This was a full, 110 years before the first entitlement states that started to truly emerge in Western Europe after World War II. Okay, many of these countries that basically got clobbered by Hitler and demolished by all the bombings and that, had to rebuild themselves, and they tended to rebuild themselves in the model of what we call an entitlement state, meaning is that there's high taxation. In other words, you keep a lot less of your paycheck, maybe 40 to up to 50% of your paycheck is taxed, removed. But you get free this, free that, free this, free health care, perhaps maybe even free housing, free vacations, free medicine, things of that nature, okay? And Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And of course, the United States went that way after the 1930s and the Great Depression, and then in the 1960s during Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency. And then, well, we kind of went through it this year with the CARES Act and all the infusion of money into the U.S. economy. But the concern that de Tocqueville had, and the concern that many political theorists have, is when people begin to see the government as the be-all, end-all, when people begin to see the government as the supplier of all my wants and needs, it tends to cause you to not want to work as much. It tends to cause you to kind of kick back more. It tends to cause you to think that, I depend on the government in so many things, okay? And so, again, political scientists and sociologists, they understand that. They understand the institutionalization of entitlement programs and entitlement societies. But de Tocqueville was writing this, 110 plus years before that, so very prescient. Okay, so I'm going to read this and we'll talk about it briefly here. But so he says this on slide 7. I seek to trace the novel features under which despotisms may appear in the world. What's despotism? Like a tyrant, okay, or big government, or the state controlling everything. That's what he's talking about, okay? The first thing that strikes the observation is an innumerable multitude of men, all equal and alike. Okay, this idea of equality. They're incessantly endeavoring to procure the petty and paltry pleasures with which they glut their lives. In other words, the stuff of life. Okay, the stuff of life, the clothing and shopping and whatever, okay, things like that. Each of them living apart is as a stranger to the fate of the rest. His children and his private friends constitute to him the whole of mankind. As for the rest of his fellow citizens, he is close to them, but he sees them not. He touches them, but he feels them not. He exists but in himself and for himself alone. In other words, kind of narcissism, right? It's all about me. Right? What's narcissism? Hey, enough about you. Can we talk about me for a little bit? He says, in a society that everyone is equal and everyone kind of gets involved in their own individual lives, people tend to turn inward, okay? So he says he touches them but feels them not. In other words, you're more concerned about yourself than other people. He exists but in himself and for himself alone. And if his kindred still remain to him, talking about his kids, he may said at any rate to have lost his country. Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. He's talking about government. Okay, when suddenly government begins to be seen as the provider for people. Okay, go on to slide number 8. Okay, and And basically, what Tocqueville's talking about here is he sees government getting bigger. He sees the state getting its hands in all kinds of cookie jars, right? In all kinds of sectors of the private sector, private business, private people's lives. But what he envisions is something he calls soft despotism, okay? Hard despotism would be like Adolf Hitler, right? Right, that whole thing, right? Soft despotism is more like kind of like a nanny, okay? Think a nanny state, okay? And that's what he's talking about here. So he says that power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood, okay? In other words, a truly good parent prepares their kids to leave, right? Little Johnny and Susie is really, really cute at 4 or 5 or 6 years old, okay? Little Johnny and Susie when they're 18 or 19, probably kind of get on your own and figure out your own life and all that kind of stuff, okay? That's what parenting prepares children for, to live independently so they can take care of themselves. They can get their own education, okay? But his concern is he sees the state as, instead of preparing people for manhood to grow up, to take care of yourself without government help, he sees it as leading to this mentality within people that I can't have a good life unless government gives me stuff. I can't have a good life unless government provides for me. And his concern is it leaves them in perpetual childhood. So he says it's like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood. But it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that the people should rejoice, provided that they think of nothing but rejoicing. Okay, I'm happy, who cares? Okay, I got free stuff, who cares? For their happiness, such a government willingly labors. Okay, think of politicians that they're pandering to all kinds of interest groups to give them what they want, to make them happy. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and the only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, think Social Security, think Medicare, Medicaid, foresees and supplies their necessities, think free healthcare, facilitates their pleasures, okay? Perhaps, again, in some European countries, they provide for their vacations, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of property, subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and the trouble of living? Okay, children, right? Are they thinking a whole lot? Are they worried about the next meal or a roof over the head? Again, unless it's some sort of an abusive situation or an extreme situation, generally no. Okay. And that's what he said, what will happen to a people who start looking to the government for everything, and the government willingly obliges and provides everything. So if you go to the last slide on this, this is slide number 9, and he says this: thus it every day renders the exercise of the free agency of man less useful, less frequent. In other words, your will is being bent, almost like a social engineering project, to the will of the state, because you don't think you can exist outside of the state providing for you. It circumscribes the will within a narrower range and gradually robs a man of all the uses of himself. The principle of equality has prepared men for these things. It has predisposed men to endure them and often look on them as benefits. Okay, so again, there's a discussion post question where you get to weigh in on this. Okay, but again, it's an interesting argument that Tocqueville makes, and those that are political theorists and historians marvel at how prescient, okay, the ability to predict the future, Tocqueville was when the state becomes the benefactor for everything. Okay, and people stop thinking and working for themselves and start relying on the government to provide for them. Okay, just kind of interesting there. Okay, let's move on here and we'll see how far we can get. I try not to keep these videos much more than 15 minutes. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, slide number 10. Okay, remember Plessy versus Ferguson. It was the court decision that said that African Americans may not be integrated within the white race, in particular in train cars, okay? As long as they can be kept separate, as long as the cars for the African American is equal to, same quality as those of the white people that inhabit them, okay? And so So basically, they said that as long as the facilities were equal, we don't have to integrate the races, okay? I remember this was in 1896. And remember what I told you, about 60 years later, it was totally reversed. And that's the case called Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Okay, the court was unanimous, 9-0, which is pretty remarkable. It wasn't that way. The Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren pressed a number of reluctant justices to go with him because he really wanted to make this be unanimous to show a clear direction of the country. But basically, they invoked the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, declaring that again, Brown versus Board of Education was obviously a school case. So they declared that segregation in public schools generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Okay, so in that case, it struck down Plessy versus Ferguson. And interestingly, there was a dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson. That's where one of the justices didn't agree. And they used a lot of the arguments from this dissenting justice's argument in Plessy versus Ferguson to basically build the argument for Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, so Brown basically, again, the case was controversial. Okay, the holding on the case was a good one, but the way the court went about it was constitutionally suspect. And what do I mean by that? The decision was good. They needed to do that, okay, because discrimination is a bad thing. Okay, prejudice is a bad thing. But the court started stepping up into the role of legislator, like Congress, in basically starting to decree a lot of remedies by which the races may be integrated. Okay, there was a busing case, which we'll get into a little bit here, different things like that. In other words, it's not that some of those things were wrong, but it was wrong for the court to do that. Okay, court doesn't have legislative authority. Remember, Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution says all legislative authority is herein granted in a Congress in the United States. When the court gets involved in legislation, it is stepping out of its bounds and it's stepping into areas of illegitimacy. So that's some of the concerns and some of the controversies with Brown versus Board of Education. Of course, in the 1950s, it was controversial anyway because of those that held to discriminatory practices. But from a constitutional standpoint, it was also suspect because of what happened afterwards. Because the court began to kind of decree, okay, the nation needs to do this and this and this and this. And Congress is like, wait a minute, that's kind of what we do. What are you doing? Okay, and so it's kind of interesting. An example of this, and I'll close with this, is the case called Swan. Go to slide number 12. If you go to slide 12, you'll see the case called Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg County Board of Education. What the court essentially did in this case is they looked at the 1954 decision, Brown versus Board of Education, and they looked at it and they said, wait, okay, we understand no segregation of the races in public facilities and schools. But they were finding out that there was still segregation going on. And so they said, basically, they decreed busing to be done within school districts so that somebody who perhaps may live right across the street from the school or close to the school, who normally would walk to the school, would now have to get on a bus and maybe go 15 miles or 20 miles down the road to be at another school so that all of these racial quotas were fulfilled, okay? Basically the decision, I'll just read it here, it's probably easier just to do it this way. Busing of children out of their neighborhoods for the purpose of achieving racial integrated schools was constitutionally permissible in cases where previous acts of racial discrimination contributed to school segregation. Okay, again, another controversial decision. Because of, first of all, the court stepping up and doing some things that, quite frankly, Congress should have written legislation to do this. Now, they didn't. Okay, and so because they were in effect somewhat sitting on their hands, the court stepped up. But again, when the court does this, it's almost like they're creating legislation. Okay, and that's not their role. Another controversy of it was for white students and African American students. they didn't like the busing in general. I mean, I remember I was 5 years old when this decision came down, and I remember my parents were hot about it. My friends' parents were hot about it. You know, I went to Lakeshore High School, which you may know where that's at here in Stevensville, but throughout the county. You know, I can recall even growing up. You know, it was very controversial and very unpopular. And it's interesting what they've found over time is in all of these attempts to integrate, they found that African American students many times like they have their own schools, and whites tend to. In other words, the old adage, "Birds of a feather flock together." It's interesting after a lot of this, and what they found out a lot of times in the busing, and I believe this decision and its enforcement ended in the early to mid 1980s, because a lot of school districts and places were kind of wringing their hands like, man, we tried this, it's not working, okay? Again, we're talking about equal protection, and we're talking about the court's attempts to try to accomplish this. And so Brown versus Board of Education, basically got the ball rolling, so to speak. Swan versus Mecklenburg was trying to continue to move it forward, albeit it was a very controversial case. So I'm going to stop there. I went over what I normally like to do, but I will begin next time with slide 14, talking about the judicial tests for equal protection.